Hello and welcome back to Project 380. On the last midget video I got the car running. Not great, but running. It definitely had a timing issue, causing the fuel vapour to come backwards out of the carbs, and it wasn't running quite as good as it should do. So I played around with it a little bit off camera, removed those spark checkers, and was keeping an eye on the timing. But there was definitely something else wrong. So today we're going to investigate and hopefully get it running a little bit better. Huh?
That was full choke.
Okay. I kept playing around with the midget engine and it never seemed to get any better, just a little bit worse, and after a little while it wouldn't even idle right. It was at this stage I had to take a few weeks off of the midget project to concentrate on the Mark II, and while I was away my dad really got his hands stuck in. He cleaned up as much as he could, gave everything a good coating of paint, sorted out that annoying rattle in the heater, and I think he'd done a pretty good job. Everything's starting to look a lot cleaner. He really went to town with the wire brush, got part of the front end removed, and he did find some more rust, and a few wiring issues that we need to sort at a later date. He also managed to find a brand new complete set of silicone hoses for the car, as the old ones were really crusty, starting to get solid, and the ends were pretty perished. So he's changed a few over. He also managed to find a second-hand fiberglass bonnet, as the old bonnet had completely rusted out and it's just not worth saving. He stripped the twin SU carbs off and sent them to his friend to ultrasonic clean. When they came back, I found out what could potentially be causing the idle issue. The bearings for the butterflies in the twin SU carbs had completely worn out, and the gasket between the carbs and the block didn't look good at all. That's that clicking sound you can hear. That's allowing excess air to enter the carbs before we want it to. So we've ordered a twin SU carb rebuild kit, and in this kit we've got everything we could possibly need to rebuild these carbs. The jets, the idle valves, new needles, new butterflies and new gaskets. And most importantly, some really detailed instructions. So I'm going to rebuild one carb at a time, and from this angle you can really see how badly this is worn. So out comes the damper, and I think this top part is called a dash pot. That's just held on with 2 screws. The whole assembly came out with it. I'm not sure whether it's meant to do that. Disconnect the choke lever. That'll allow me to take the jet tube from the bottom of the bowl and remove from the carb. Then the jet tube spring off of the carb simply unscrews. I'm now fully removing that choke lever and the main bolt that attaches the bowl to the carb. Now time to get that worn out butterfly out of the carb. The main disc is just held in with 2 screws, and then the whole assembly can slide out the side. You can now really see how badly that's worn. It's actually got quite a lip on it, compared to the nice shiny new one, which looks a lot better. There was a little locking plate that I had to bend back to get that nut off. Throw away the old throttle shaft and replace it with the nice new one. And I've put everything back in the same order I took it apart. tightened that down and pushed the lock plate back into place, locking that nut in. Getting the choke lever and spring back in place was an absolute fiddly nightmare, and it took me quite some time to get it right. A little bit of grease in it to stop it seizing, and then back in with the main throttle shaft, a little bit of lubricant just to ease it in. And then in with the throttle plate or butterfly. I actually found out this only went in one way, as the edges were slightly angled. Again, just held in with 2 screws, and these are safety screws that once that plate is in place, we need to open those screws out, basically so they don't work themselves out and get sucked into the engine. That moves a lot better, and they're not rattling about in the carbs anymore. Luckily I didn't have to have these carbs machined, it was only the throttle shaft that was worn, not the carbs. Some nice new jet tubes, just a little bit of oil to help them in. I've made sure that moves all nice and free. Pulled it back out, and replaced the jet spring with a nice new one, and then connected the jet spring to the bowl. Connected the choke lever to the jet and made sure everything moved freely. I've taken the piston with the needle out of the dash pot, oiled that up, made sure it's moving freely in the carb. I've put a new spring on it and oiled up the dash pot to make sure that piston goes up and down nicely. Hello.
Have you seen,
and screwed it all back onto the carb. This damper seal was well and truly squashed, so that really needed replacing. Now this part was quite important. That dash pot actually needs some oil in it, and after a bit of research I found out I could just use 3-in-1, and that needed to be filled up to a certain level. To find out if you've got the right level of oil in the dash pot, you have to pull that damper in and out, and as long as it makes a squelching sound, you've got enough oil in there. Onto the fuel bowl. This is the top of the bowl. I'm now removing the float, which is only held in with 1 pin. Slide that out and remove the float, and remove the old float needle and the float needle guide. I've put a new float needle guide in as I've got a slightly different float needle. And a nice new pin for that float, which was a little tricky to get in. Everything's moving fine. I can now bolt that back onto the bowl. On the bolt that holds the bowl to the carbs, there's a couple of seals that I've just replaced, and now I can bolt that bowl back onto the carb. So that's one carb out of the twin SU setup, all rebuilt. I'm going to do the other one off of camera, and then it's all ready to assemble on the inlet manifold. Some nice new gaskets, and then the heat shield plate, which has been nicely painted by my dad. Some more gaskets, some plastic carb spacers, some more gaskets, and then finally the carbs. The nuts that held the carbs onto the inlet manifold were a bit of a pain to get in. I sort of had to pull the carb away from the manifold a little bit, put the washer and nut on, and then I could tighten them down. And then to go between the left and right carbs, there are some throttle and choke linkages, which I've just put a little bit of grease on. And I just moved over one side of the linkage to allow the other carb to go on the inlet manifold, which I'll adjust in a minute. So tightened up the second carb, moved those linkages across and made sure they're sitting in the right place on the arms. Once they were in place, tightened them down and made sure everything's free moving and not binding up. Now we need some way of those linkages returning after they've been moved, and that is with some big springs. They go from the linkage arms down onto the heat shield plate. One isn't quite enough, that's why it requires two. And the same with the choke. Make sure everything's moving properly and returning as it should, and that's the carbs and inlet manifold all assembled and ready for the car. Then I had a big camera malfunction again and lost a load of footage. But that is all installed back on the car now with some nice new fuel hoses, as they were pretty rotten, and we've ditched them big bulky air filters and gone for some nice shiny pancake filters, which I think look a lot better. We really needed a new choke cable and throttle cable as the old ones had completely had it. So my dad's installing them in the background while I'm putting a fuel filter in. Believe it or not, there's no fuel filter on this car, and I remembered what came out of that tank, so I wanted to put one in. This may be just a temporary place for now, but at least it should protect the carbs. Nice new throttle cable and choke cable with some nice new cable clamps, as the old ones had completely rusted. I may have done the throttle clamp up a little bit tight, but that's all in there and installed now, and all working how it should. Now we're almost ready to try and start this, but I really wasn't happy with the earth cable. It was sort of bodged together, so I've got a nice new one, tighten that up to the chassis and the battery. And reattach the positive. I just didn't realise the keys were still in the ignition. So that's the fuel pump you can hear pumping away in the background, and it's already filled that fuel filter up. I'm going to guess the keys are in the ignition, are they?
Yep.
So let's see whether it runs any better. And by the way, I removed the exhaust, but the exhaust manifold is still on. Right, full choke. Yep, give it a go. So here I'm just playing around with the adjustment on the jet tube, just trying to get it to idle and run a little bit better, and not stutter when I come off of throttle. We couldn't run this for too long, as you can see there's no radiator or coolant. Yeah. So that's all for this episode. As per usual, like, comment, share and subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.